Jeffrey Epstein is dead, but the people who say they were harmed by him are not. And right now they're speaking louder than ever. In the past several days, new interviews and public statements from senior officials at the Department of Justice and the FBI have reignited controversy over the Epstein files. Who has been investigated, what has been redacted, and whether the public has been told the full story. Officials have suggested that there are no additional criminal cases moving forward, but victims and their advocates are pushing back. Some say they were never contacted. Some say their stories were never formally investigated. Some insist that Epstein did not act alone, and that the story being closed does not match what they experienced. Meanwhile, portions of the newly released files have been criticized for heavy redactions, and in some cases, inconsistent ones. The result? Confusion, distrust, and a widening gap between official conclusions and survivor testimony. This episode isn't about speculation. It's about the people whose names were buried in court filings, sealed agreements, and non-disclosure settlements. While the institutions argue over paperwork, the central question remains: who was harmed? Who was heard? And who was quietly dismissed? This is the story of the victims, and why their voices are once again at the center of a storm that refuses to die. This is Info Inquisitive, and this is the third chapter in our deep dive investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. Not just the man, but the machine around him. If you haven't watched the first 2 episodes yet, start there. In episode 1, we broke down how Epstein built his fortune, or at least the version of it we were allowed to see, tracing his climb from Dalton to Wall Street, to the private islands and elite circles that shielded him. In episode 2, we examined Ghislaine Maxwell, the social architect, the recruiter, the bridge between privilege and exploitation. And in this episode, we're going to go deeper, not just into survivor testimony, not just into patterns of grooming, but into something unfolding right now. Finally, telling the full story of the victims means examining how the Epstein files have been handled, how investigations have been conducted, and how federal authorities, including the Department of Justice and FBI leadership, have addressed, or failed to address, the broader network victims insist existed. If you care about accountability, real accountability, subscribe. Because this series isn't about outrage, it's about documentation. Jeffrey Epstein did not prowl dark alleys. He didn't operate in secrecy the way people imagine predators do. He operated in plain sight. The girls didn't stumble into his world by accident. They were selected, identified, approached. A teenage girl would be approached by someone slightly older. Another girl, someone friendly. It seemed normal, non-threatening. She would be told about a wealthy man who paid for massages. Nothing sexual, just a massage. $200 for an hour. It was easy money. For many of the girls, that was life-changing. They were not recruited from elite private schools. They were often recruited from financially unstable homes, broken households, foster care, situations where $200 wasn't just money. It was relief. Relief for a phone bill, groceries, school clothes. A first visit would be arranged. The girl would arrive at a house that didn't look dangerous at all. In fact, it looked extraordinary. Marble floors, high ceilings, staff moving calmly through the background, the kind of place that signals wealth, not risk. Someone would explain what was expected, how to greet him, where to sit, what to say, what not to say. There was an unspoken script. Not always written down, but clearly understood. Many victims later said they didn't fully understand what was happening until much later. Not because they were naive, but because the system was designed to confuse. It was framed as transactional, just a massage. Quick money, easy money. She would be told she could bring friends. That's how it multiplied. How he used his victims to victimize others. Not through immediate force, not through overt violence, at least not in the beginning. It scaled through normalization, through repetition, through the illusion that this was opportunity, not exploitation. Over time, the boundaries shifted. What began as something positioned as benign slowly blurred into something else. The requests slowly escalated. The expectations started to change. The money sometimes increased, and so did the pressure. The operation relied on credibility. A mansion in Palm Beach, a townhouse in Manhattan, private jets waiting on runways, photographs with famous people lining the walls. Predators aren't supposed to operate in spaces like that. But this one did. When powerful adults move through the same rooms, when politicians, executives, celebrities walk in and out, it sends a powerful psychological signal. This must be legitimate. This must be normal. This must be allowed. The girls weren't recruited in isolation. They were recruited in proximity to power. And that proximity acted as insulation. In a confrontation between a teenager and a billionaire, the scale is already tilted. Who has the resources? The lawyers? The social capital? The presumption of credibility? That imbalance wasn't accidental. It was structural. When people try to understand how something like this happens, they often picture violence as the starting point. They imagine force, abduction, threats. A sudden, dramatic event that clearly marks the beginning of harm. But what happened in this case rarely looked like that. Grooming is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself as danger. It unfolds slowly, carefully, and often under the guise of generosity. For many of the girls, the first interaction felt strangely ordinary. They were noticed. They were complimented. They were told they were mature, intelligent, special. They were asked about their lives, sometimes about their family struggles, sometimes about their ambitions. And they were listened to. That listening, that being seen, it mattered. Especially for teenagers who came from instability, fractured households, financial stress, or environments where attention from adults was inconsistent or conditional. When a powerful adult directs focused attention at a young person, especially in an environment of luxury and apparent success, it can feel validating rather than threatening. The early encounters were structured to feel transactional, not coercive. It didn't present itself as exploitation. It presented itself as opportunity. What makes grooming so effective is that it doesn't collapse boundaries all at once. It shifts them. Each adjustment is small enough to rationalize in the moment. By the time the situation crosses an unmistakable line, the psychological groundwork has already been laid. There may be money involved. There may be gifts. There may be photos. There may simply be shame. The internal belief that you participated, that you agreed to something, that you should have known better. That shame becomes its own containment mechanism. Grooming thrives in that distortion. It works because it replaces fear with familiarity. It conditions rather than compels. It creates a psychological landscape in which saying no feels complicated, socially, emotionally, and financially. What unfolded was structured, predictable, replicated across locations and across years. This was not random misconduct. It was a system built on incremental manipulation, one that relied less on overt force and more on social engineering. When we misunderstand grooming as sudden violence, we fail to recognize how quietly it embeds itself and how long it can operate before anyone calls it what it is. One of the most common questions people ask when they first encounter this story is simple and often painfully naive. Why didn't they just tell someone? But that question assumes silence is passive. In reality, silence is often engineered. For many of the girls, the situation did not register immediately as a crime. It unfolded gradually, wrapped in money, attention, and proximity to power. By the time clarity arrived, by the time they understood the harm, the emotional terrain was already complicated. Some felt ashamed. Some blamed themselves. Some feared they would not be believed. And some had already been shown, implicitly, how the system worked. For a young person with limited resources, limited social capital, and limited faith in authority, reporting a powerful adult is not a straightforward decision. It is a calculation. Who will believe me? What will happen to me? Will my parents find out? Will I be exposed? Will I be blamed? And those fears are not irrational. Historically, when young girls have accused powerful men, the response has not always been protective. It has often been skeptical, dissecting, public. The legal system can feel less like a shield and more like a spotlight. There were also legal mechanisms that reinforced silence: non-disclosure agreements, settlements, confidentiality clauses, documents signed under pressure, often with limited understanding of their long-term implications. These agreements did not just resolve disputes, they contained narratives. Silence, in that context, becomes structural. And then there's the psychological component. Grooming complicates memory. It complicates emotion. And it complicates language. When exploitation is layered with moments of attention, with gifts, with perceived opportunity, it can take years for someone to fully process what happened to them. It is easier sometimes to file it away, to minimize it, to survive it quietly. Silence is often mistaken for consent. But in cases like this, silence was more often a product of imbalance, of age, of power, of resources, of credibility. And when the first few voices that do speak up are dismissed or quietly settled, that silence deepens. And so many stayed silent, not because nothing happened, but because the cost of speaking felt higher than the promise of justice. It would take years and multiple investigations before enough voices aligned to make silence unsustainable. And even then, the system did not move quickly. Among all the survivors who came forward, one name became almost inseparable from the Epstein story: Virginia Giuffre. From the moment her allegations entered the public record, she refused to stay in the shadows. She did more than testify. She advocated. She founded a non-profit dedicated to helping other survivors, and she spoke out again and again about what she said she endured. Giuffre's story became one of the most widely recognized for a reason. She told a detailed personal narrative that brought the scandal into public consciousness. She described how she first encountered Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell as a teenager, how she said she was trafficked to provide services, and how that experience shaped her life for decades. Her testimony, her visibility, and that now iconic photograph with a powerful figure shifted how the world saw the scandal, and it shifted how institutions reacted. Her influence wasn't just symbolic. Giuffre pursued multiple legal actions, including a civil suit against Prince Andrew that was settled in 2022. And she used her platform to urge survivors to speak out and seek justice. But the human cost of that visibility was steep. In April 2025, at the age of 41, Virginia Giuffre died by suicide at her home in Western Australia. Her passing was met with shock and deep sorrow across the survivor community, with her family and supporters emphasizing her courage and the emotional and physical burdens she carried in the years after going public. Those who knew her and worked with her described a woman who gave everything she had to telling the truth as she saw it, even as she faced intense scrutiny, legal battles, and the strain of carrying stories most people never imagine sharing. As she urged in a note found after her death, she wanted survivors to stand together and continue pushing for awareness and justice. And yet, her death, coming at a moment when the conversation about Epstein and power was intensifying, led many to ask uncomfortable questions about the toll of bearing witness. Some wondered whether the emotional strain of her lifelong advocacy, the legal battles, and the public pressure played a role. Others noted that she had recently faced personal challenges and strained relationships with family, including being separated from her children for a period before her death. This is a deeply human and tragic aspect of the story. Not because it fuels conspiracy, but because it underscores the emotional and psychological toll on the very people who had the courage to speak up. It's a reminder that behind every legal filing, every public interview, and every headline, there are real lives, irrevocably changed, often painfully so. For years, the Epstein files were treated like this mythical thing, this locked drawer that, if opened, would finally explain everything. So when the US Department of Justice began releasing massive new tranches of material, millions of pages, plus thousands of videos, and an enormous archive of images, It felt like the moment people had been waiting for. But almost immediately, the release didn't feel like clarity. It felt like a wildfire. Instead of a clean record, organized, contextualized, carefully redacted, it landed like a data dump. Enormous, disorienting, and in some cases, controversial for what it didn't protect. There were reports and reactions suggesting that victim identifying information may have appeared in materials that went public, leading to criticism and subsequent corrections, an issue that survivors and advocates have been warning about for years. Transparency without care can become harm in a new form. And then there was the second outrage. Not just what may have been exposed, but what was still hidden. Alongside those huge releases, people noticed what looked like inconsistent redactions, and the public debate became less about Epstein himself and more about who the system was protecting now. That's the reality of these releases. They're not just a pile of documents. They're a political event. And the moment the files hit the internet, the story split into two tracks. One track was the institutional narrative, the official view that investigators reviewed the evidence and did not find enough to prosecute additional powerful people beyond Epstein and Maxwell. The Associated Press, for example, reported on FBI conclusions reflected in internal records, substantial evidence of Epstein's abuse, but insufficient proof to support broader charges against other high-profile figures, alongside the claim that there was no verified client list in the evidence. But the second track was the one survivors have been living in the entire time. The one where victims have said, consistently, that the harm didn't exist in a vacuum, that there were networks, that there were patterns, that there were other men. And that gap between what victims say happened and what institutions say they can prove became even louder after this release. The files don't just contain courtroom transcripts and old reports. They contain connective tissue, emails, relationship maps, financial records, and evidence of how major institutions interacted with Epstein, even after he was widely known to be dangerous. You see it in reporting on banking behavior, like new details about how Deutsche Bank continued providing services and facilitating large cash transactions even after deciding to exit the relationship, own closing accounts after Epstein's 2019 arrest. You see it in the continuing fallout, resignations, inquiries, reputational collapse, especially internationally, as new releases reignited scrutiny across Europe. And you see it in the way the files keep doing what this case has always done. They expose not just one predator, but a system that repeatedly failed to stop him. That's why these releases don't land like answers. For victims, the file dump isn't a spectacle. It's their lives, their bodies, their childhoods. And for some of them, it's the difference between being believed and being erased. And that brings us to the part of this story that's unfolding right now. Because to tell the truth about the victims, we also have to talk about the people who currently control the narrative. Not Epstein, not Maxwell, but the modern institutions, DOJ leadership, federal investigators, and the political pressure surrounding what gets released, what gets withheld, and whose voices still aren't being centered in the process. When the latest batch of Epstein files was released, it wasn't just journalists digging through documents. Congress wanted answers as well. And suddenly, the people sitting in the hot seat weren't traffickers or socialites. They were the heads of the institutions that claimed the investigation was complete. Attorney General Pam Bondi faced a heated House oversight hearing where lawmakers from both parties pressed her on what exactly had been released and what hadn't. Over and over again, she defended the Department of Justice's handling of the files. She said the materials released represented compliance with transparency requirements. She insisted that investigators had reviewed the evidence and that no prosecutable evidence existed against additional high-profile individuals. But the hearing wasn't calm. It wasn't routine. Members of Congress openly questioned whether victims had been properly consulted before the release. Some accused the DOJ of mishandling sensitive information. Others suggested the redactions were inconsistent, that some names were blacked out while others appeared in contexts that made little sense. At one point, the exchange grew personal. Critics challenged Bondi's legal interpretations. She pushed back forcefully. According to multiple outlets, the tone became combative, with lawmakers questioning whether the department was protecting powerful figures rather than protecting victims. Bondi maintained that the files did not contain a verified client list. She repeated that investigators had not found evidence sufficient to charge additional individuals. She framed the controversy as political noise layered on top of a completed criminal matter. But here's the thing. When you say there are no additional suspects, and survivors say they were trafficked to multiple men, that gap doesn't disappear because a hearing ends. It widens. And then came FBI Director Kash Patel. Patel's testimony was similarly intense. Lawmakers pressed him on whether the FBI had fully investigated every name connected to Epstein's orbit. Some members questioned whether internal documents contradicted public statements. Others accused him directly of withholding information or minimizing the scope of the investigation. One Republican lawmaker publicly challenged Patel over what he described as bombshell inconsistencies between earlier investigative claims and what had been released. There were accusations that the Bureau had changed its tone, first suggesting broader networks, then later saying no further wrongdoing could be substantiated. Patel defended the Bureau's work. He stated that the investigation had been thorough, that resources had been allocated, that evidence simply did not support broader criminal charges. But the hearings revealed something deeper than disagreement. They revealed distrust. Distrust between Congress and the DOJ. Distrust between lawmakers and the FBI. Distrust between the public and the institutions tasked with accountability. And through all of it, victims and advocates were saying something painfully simple. We weren't contacted. We weren't asked. We weren't included. Some survivors have publicly stated they were not interviewed during more recent reviews. Others have said that sweeping conclusions about no additional wrongdoers do not align with their lived experiences. Now, to be clear, hearings are political. Emotions run high. Allegations get amplified. But what matters here isn't partisan theatre. It's this. When institutions say, "We've seen everything, there's nothing more to charge," and survivors say, "There's more," that tension becomes the story. Not because it proves conspiracy, but because it exposes fracture. And here's what makes this moment historically unusual. You have an investigation that officially concluded years ago, and yet Congress is still fighting about what's in the files. That's not normal closure. That's unfinished business. If the files truly closed the case, there wouldn't be hearings this volatile. There wouldn't be lawmakers accusing federal officials of concealment. There wouldn't be victims demanding to know why their experiences don't match the institutional narrative. The reality that institutions continued working with Epstein long after warning signs. And the ongoing discomfort around transparency. That's what these hearings laid bare. And for survivors, a trust deficit feels a lot like betrayal. At some point in every scandal like this, people start asking for closure. And yet, the questions haven't stopped. Because the story was never just about one man. It was about access, about wealth, about systems that protected power longer than they protected children. And at the center of it all were girls who were told, explicitly and implicitly, that they didn't matter as much as the men in the room. If you've been following this series, you know this isn't just about Epstein. It's about the ecosystem that allowed him to exist. And that ecosystem doesn't disappear just because one man did. If you found value in this deep dive, if you believe stories like this deserve context, not just headlines, then subscribe to Info Inquisitive. Hit like. Leave your thoughts below. Engage respectfully, especially when discussing survivors. And if you haven't watched the earlier episodes in this series, The Money, The Machine, Ghislaine Maxwell's role, start there. Because together, they tell a much bigger story. I'll see you in the next investigation.